Earlier in this newscast, we heard the word transparency used when talking about the audit of the state education department. You hear that word a lot when discussing government. What exactly does it mean? How is it legislated? And how transparent is Oklahoma government? We delve into those topics in this week's in-depth conversation with Susan Cadeau and her panel of guests.
Yes, thank you, Rich. I am joined by an esteemed panel of guests to discuss this issue. First of all, we have Andy Moore, who is the Executive Director for Freedom of Information Oklahoma. We have Kathryn Gardner, who is the attorney with Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And we have Ben Felder, who is a reporter with The Frontier, and they cover everything of interest to their readers in Oklahoma. Thank all of you for being with us today. I'm going to throw the first question out to Andy. I want to talk about we have two laws in Oklahoma. One is the Open Meetings Act, and the other is the Open Records Act. Can you kind of quickly, what is the difference between the two?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having us, Susan. So as the name suggests, the Open Meeting Act pertains to issues related to meetings of public bodies. So it's everything from how the agenda is written to who can access the meeting, who can be there, the rules governing executive sessions, and the reasons that a public body could call an executive session. So everything to do with the meeting itself. And then the Open Records Act deals with records, of course. So everything from documents or data created by a state agency to communications within those agencies and outside those agencies. Anything that's would be considered a record is under that.
Kathryn, who can request open records or access to these things? Does it have to be a media organization, or can it be anyone?
It can be anyone. The Open Records Act and Open Meeting Act applies to anyone in the state who wants to be more fully informed about their government. And it's a great way to get that information, figure out what's going on in your local town hall, and participate in the happenings and the governance.
All right, Ben, I want to come to you as a reporter, and you guys do a lot of great watchdog reporting with The Frontier. Have you ever had to tackle this issue of the open records, trying to get open records, or trying to see about access to a meeting that might have been closed that maybe shouldn't have been?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say open records and open meetings is kind of the bread and butter of what we do as journalists, especially for us in kind of an investigative realm. And I mean, I could show you a spreadsheet of this past year that I keep of all records requests that I've made to various government agencies, and you know, it's well over 100 this year. You know, this is the way that we, you know, the open meeting provides us a glimpse of votes. You know, whether it's a city council or a state agency, you know, making kind of a final decision, and the open records is often our glimpse at how we got to that point in the meeting. You know, whether or not you're asking for emails between government officials, or you're asking for memos or reports that government staff created to help elected officials make decisions. For the most part, anything, and there are exceptions that we could probably get into, but for the most part, anything like Andy said that is created, you know, by a government entity is subject to open records. And in this day and age, I think that creates a lot more opportunities and even a lot more challenges.
So my last foundational question is going to go to Andy. What are the steps? What does someone do? Because, you know, maybe folks don't know they can access these open records just as individuals. So give a little information about what steps they take.
Sure. Yeah. So if you are someone who's interested in gaining access to some kind of record from a public entity, honestly, the best step is to call and find out to whom you should direct your request, and see if they can give you some guidance on what specific document or name of that is that you're trying to request, right? A lot of times people just want the budget, and you might get the budget, but it might be as a PDF or as an Excel spreadsheet, or it could be a stack of receipts, you know, for certain entities. And so being sure that you know exactly what it is you're looking for. You know, we really encourage people to kind of crowdsource some knowledge. So talk to reporters like Ben, talk to attorneys like Kathryn, and see if they have any insight or can help direct you. You're always welcome to call us as well. But we find that making a precise request for a certain date period, right, a certain period in time for the exact items or type of information you're looking for, and to the extent you can, getting that request to the person or office that would be fulfilling the request usually nets the best benefit in the end.
All right, let's get into some nitty gritty now. Kathryn, I want to come to you. You have experience accessing documents through the Open Records Act. You represent journalists in Oklahoma through the Oklahoma Association of Broadcasters. Has there typically been a problem in Oklahoma accessing records, or are we doing pretty well as far as transparency with government entities?
That's a great question. I would say that in my work doing kind of enforcement of the Open Records Act, I really have seen across the state what I would call a culture of noncompliance. These public bodies and public entities have obligations under state law that they must fulfill. So these aren't just, high-minded ideals of transparency and accountability. These are things that are set down in law that everybody from your school board to the governor's office is supposed to be meeting those obligations. And frequently what we see is that those obligations have been long ignored. And of course, there are outliers in that. We're very grateful for our partners in the government who really take those responsibilities seriously and really do a great job of getting information out to folks. But I think across the board, we've really seen in Oklahoma that there is a lack of urgency around these issues.
Ben, what do you think that is here in Oklahoma?
I think there's multiple reasons. One issue I run into a lot is if you're making a request of a government entity that is not used to responding to requests, sometimes there can just be some lack of understanding or kind of lack of a better term, ignorance on their side, especially if you're talking about maybe a small county sheriff's department or kind of another rural city hall. Sometimes you do run into that. Which is why when I make requests, I always, include in the letter, I cite the specific statute that kind of walks through. But other times it is intentional. A lot of times it is intentional. And I think we've especially seen in Oklahoma kind of the blending of public and private as a way sometimes to intentionally try to hide information, but other times just gives an excuse. And for example, I think, a story that we've seen a lot of over the last few years is virtual charter schools that are using private companies as management companies, and there's been debate and lawsuits over whether or not a private company who's acting on behalf of the public entity is required to give up that information and that data. We've seen cases where government entities have just intentionally slowed down the process. But I also think one of the reasons we've seen a problem in Oklahoma, and I think this problem is being addressed, is we haven't really had an enforcement mechanism. I mean, there is an enforcement tool. I mean, often it's we predicated on it, whether or not a local prosecutor wants to take up a violation of an Open Records Act. But fewer media outlets have access to legal resources. That's what makes Kathryn and her organization so vital. It's why we were so grateful that they chose Oklahoma. I think they chose Oklahoma because we have an issue. And I think what we're seeing over the past year is, having that kind of legal representation is starting to turn the tide. We've already seen, at our outlet and many others, we've already seen cases of us getting access to documents and records that I believe we would not have gotten access to if we didn't have this kind of resource.
So Kathryn, I'm going to come back to you really quickly because Ben mentioned they chose Oklahoma. Explain what he's talking about there.
Absolutely. So I work for an organization called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And historically, our work takes place in Washington, D.C., and we try to get those resources out across the country. And in the last couple of years, we have launched an initiative called the Local Legal Initiative to bring those resources and concentrate them in areas of the country that are really in need of legal resources to help reporters do do their job. So Oklahoma was chosen as a jurisdiction that had a high need for legal support of journalists, partially for the reasons that Ben mentioned. And we have been here since coming up on 1 year now, and have seen a really great reception, and hope to continue doing the great work that we've been able to so far with all of our partners.
Andy, now you've listened to what they have both said. I didn't realize it was that big of a problem in Oklahoma. Is it? Have you looked at other states? Or, is it that big of an issue? And if not, why don't we hear more about it from our local journalists, our state journalists?
Sure. A lot of the trends that we see in Oklahoma, sadly, we also see in other parts of the country. In the last few years, there's certainly been a pushback against these transparency laws, a reluctance or an avoidance of the public's inquiring eye, I think, about a lot of these things. And we see this from, all levels of government. I spoke to a city council member from a town in Northeast Oklahoma yesterday. She was calling to ask some questions because the mayor of their town had subcontracted out some core city services to a private engineering firm, and by doing so was circumventing the transparency laws that Oklahoma has to protect the public and to give the public oversight over our government functions. And so that's at a very local level. At a much higher level, our state legislature exempted themselves from the Open Records Act and the Open Meeting Act. And so the very laws that they passed, they exempted themselves. And if we look at how that sets the tone and perhaps the expectation for other levels of government, that's the thing that we would love to see changed, because we believe that all aspects of government, from the governor's office to the state legislature and on down to your city council and school board, should be subject to the same laws. For the very reason that it gives the public that check and balance that's very necessary on our government.
I have so many questions based on what you just said. And Andy, how is it legal for a governmental body to exempt themselves from laws that address governmental bodies?
Sure. It's legal because the legislature is who wrote the laws in the first place, right? So they get to pick who is subject and who is not. And, sadly, since our transparency laws were passed a few decades ago, we have seen an increasing number of exemptions added to the law. So lots of agencies have, through friends or good lobbyists, have been successful in adding their agency to the list of groups that are exempt in whole or in part to certain aspects of the law. And each time that happens, it chips away right at that sunshine that is needed to hold the government accountable. And so, we've been working with members of the legislature and certainly building a coalition out in just the public to raise the awareness about this, because as Kathryn said earlier, these transparency laws aren't just for the media. They really are for all of us, right? Most of the phone calls I get are from regular folks across Oklahoma who are trying to get access to sometimes their own records, right, that are in the custody of a state agency.
Ben, we're coming up close to our time, but I do want to come to you and ask you quickly, for the general public, why is it important that we have this transparency in government? As a journalist to you, why is it important that you have this? Why should this be of importance to all Oklahomans?
Well, for the public, it's important because it's our government. I mean, these are our documents. These are our, this is our money. It would be absurd to think about, running your own household and not having access, to your bank account or other vital information. And so it starts with the fact that we have a right as the public, the overseers of these government entities and these people that we put in charge, to have access. And as Andy said, it's not, there's no special license that a journalist possesses that it gives us the ability to make these records requests. I mean, obviously we may be more familiar with the process and that's an advantage, but even as a private citizen over the past year, I've had an issue with the city related to some utilities, and I put in a records request as a private citizen. Not because I was going to write a story, but wanting to seek information about local utilities and some impact that it had on my own property. So this is a tool for everyone to use. And I think another important point to make is I think it's becoming harder because we probably are seeing fewer requests made. There's fewer journalists. And so I think in some regards, we see fewer requests made. I've even seen, some of these exemptions put in, and the argument is like, well, we're not seeing people ask for this information. So what's the big deal if we hide it? Even if people aren't asking for the information, it still needs to be made public. But I love it when you see private citizens make these requests, because this is something that we should be utilizing. The more the merrier.
All right, well, that's our time. Thank you to all three of you for joining us and giving us this important information. And I hope it helps folks out there, other entities around them, accountable. Thank you very much.